then we can move. Mike.
Whoa. All right, sorry. All right, I welcome again everyone to the first of two afternoon sessions for our conference. My name is Laura Wexler, and I join in the chorus of thanks, especially to Marianne Hirsch and Kate Trebus, but also to everyone from the Engendering Archives project, including the graduate student coordinators who worked very hard and in a long conversation, who gave the vision and the support that has had as one of its culminations this conference. I also want to express my particular gratitude for the welcome extended to the Yale University Public Humanities Program, baby fledgling program. New Haven is one of New York City's less cosmopolitan cousins, and we're often quite aware of that fact, though I will say that we do have our own historical claims to many kinds of ruins of neighborhoods and liveliness in our city. Indeed, it has struck me in listening to the presentations yesterday and today that New Yorkers have distinct stories to tell about 9/11 as a disaster that still cuts so close to the bone, even while its profile in, say, Kabul or Bogota or Tel Aviv or elsewhere makes different kinds of marks upon the material and psychic and bodily horizon. One of the most vivid things I am learning from listening to the papers is how very important the medium is through which we hear or speak of the injuries of cities, and especially how important artists are for bringing us the news. It's been interesting to see or sense how place-based, body-based, performance-based scholarship negotiates the boundaries and limits of the archive and helps us to see and hear connections to what we otherwise would not be able to notice. The two panels this afternoon are about the news that artists bring of ruin and recovery, perpetration and resistance. I will in particular be listening for the ways in which people successfully challenge the modes in which even this kind of news can be silenced. I was in New Haven on 9/11. Like millions of others, I had primarily at first a visual and oral experience, watching and listening to the CNN reporters. However, later in that day, it became an embodied event in a specifically and awfully unembodied way for me, due to the absence of actual bodies. My husband is a scientist who has a laboratory at Yale New Haven Hospital, and he, as were all others, were required to clear out their labs to make way for the many beds for the many survivors who Yale New Haven Hospital thought would be brought as a regional trauma center to New Haven. I went to help Bruce and to see what I could do to help, and as we sat there after a while, of course, you know already, it became clear that no one was coming. So that terrible, resonant, and regional absence of bodies colors my 9/11 experience. At the 10th year anniversary, still in New Haven, I wanted to participate in some way in the moment of remembrance. So I did the online exercise that the New York Times Online offered. Where were you on 9/11? A digital map allowed me to locate Yale New Haven Hospital and to tell my story in, 120 characters. However, it then asked, how were you feeling? And out of a very small number of choices, you had to check one in order to get out of the program. In other words, in order for me to have my story registered, I had to tell how I was feeling. And I don't know, I can't remember what they are. The only one I remember is angry, because that's the only one that had the remotest connection to how I was feeling. And I wanted my story registered, so I checked that. And I'm really angry that I had to check that, because angry in no way describes the mixture of things that I was feeling. I felt that my memory or my attempt to participate had been bundled like a bad derivative, something else that New York has been good at. I believe that we will learn today, this afternoon, how people can and have challenged the bad derivatives, taking them apart and rooting them in the more detailed, more complex, and better ways of being told. I have just a couple of announcements to make, and then I will leave for the panel. But one is that it was mistakenly said to you yesterday that the International Center of Photography show on 9/11 exhibition that your program is your entry to, that the special docents show to which everyone has been invited was this afternoon at 3, but actually it's tomorrow afternoon at 3. So please remember that that show at ICP is open. The docents tour, of course, the show is there, but the docents tour is open tomorrow at 3. Laurie Novak's show, photography show in the Neiman Gallery in Dodge Hall, will be open today till 3:30, and we have a break from 3 o'clock to 3:30. So I urge you to take that opportunity, if you haven't already, to see that photography show. And finally, we're going to take a moment to hear from a student who has come. I don't know why I checked off student. I mean, there must be other things that we could also call you. But Alicia has come from Occupy Wall Street to just make an announcement to us today. Thank you.
Hi, it's good to see you all. My name is Alicia White. I'm a graduate student here at the Institute for the Study of Human Rights. And I've been living at Occupy Wall Street since September 22nd. For me, thank you. Thank you. When I made the commitment to live there, it was much warmer and considerably less wet. So it was easier then. For me, what Occupy Wall Street means is that people who are isolated by an economic and social culture that victimizes them have had an opportunity to come together and find hope in the solidarity that comes with standing next to someone who suffers as you do or in a different way and is willing to speak out about it. So in the celebration of surviving as long as we have, especially staying up all night yesterday and not getting arrested in the morning for most of us, which was very exciting experience. I encourage you to get on YouTube and watch the video of us finding out we weren't going to be evicted. It's a wonderful thing to watch. In celebrating that hope of coming together, we decided to throw a party today. And I wanted to invite all of you. So starting, of course, you all will be here at 5 o'clock, but this conference will, I believe, adjourn at 5:45 today. And starting at 5 p.m. in Times Square, we are throwing a party to celebrate what we've done so far, to celebrate the hope that we found in each other, and to look forward at what's coming next. This is also an International Day of Solidarity, so events are happening all over the world and the country. If you would like to come, there will be thousands of us in Times Square wearing white. We're having musical performances. We have cabaret performers. We'll be there trying to enjoy each other and hopefully enjoy some of you. If you'd like any additional details on it, we made a website. It's called theoccupationparty.com, and we'll be there from 5 to 7, and at 7 p.m. we are going to have a subway march. We are going to take over MTA and go back home to Liberty Plaza around 7 o'clock. So I encourage all of you to come join us. It should be a festive and inspiring environment for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura, and also Lisa for that generous invitation, which it's an extraordinary important event that's going on downtown, and so it's nice to have that sentiment, those energies actually flow from here to there. My name is Mabel Wilson. I'm a professor here at GSAPP. I'm moderating this panel along with my colleague Rosalind Morris from anthropology. This afternoon's panel spatializing afterlife. Wounded cities, wounded landscapes, wounded lives. Out of the decomposition of material remains, how do people create strategies of recomposition that rebuild the social spaces and relations fundamental to imagining new forms of social engagement and political action? This afternoon's 3 presentations envision what new forms and formations enable social life, organic life, to revive and thrive at places of immense catastrophic upheaval and sites of degradation that may take decades and generations to remediate and rebuild. We are pleased to have as our first presenter E.L. Wiseman, an architect, writer, and director of the Center for Research Architecture at Goldsmiths University, London. Since 2007, he is a member of the architectural collective Decolonizing Architecture in Bayet Sohor, Palestine. His most recent book, The Least of All Possible Evils, Humanitarian Violence from Aran to Gaza, is forthcoming. Our next speaker, based in Johannesburg, Clive Vandenberg devotes much of his time to the curation and design of heritage projects independently and in collaboration. He designs, researches, and curates exhibitions, public art projects, and museum developments. The wonderful collection, The Art of Clive Vandenberg, Unlearning the Grounds of Art, was written together with my co-moderator, Rosalind Morris. And our final presenter for Spatializing Afterlife, Teddy Cruz, established his research-based architecture practice, Estudio Teddy Cruz, in San Diego, California in 2000. He is currently a professor in public culture and urbanism in the visual arts department at UC San Diego, where he co-founded CUE, the Center for Urban Ecologies. In 2008, Teddy represented the US in the Venice Architecture Biennale, and his work was most recently included in the MoMA exhibition, Small Scale, Big Change. So we'll start this afternoon with E.L. Wiseman.
Thank you, also for the organizers, and I apologize for not standing up. I came from the plane a little bit upside down, as they say. But I would like to speak about forensic architecture, in fact show a series of snippets from that project, scenes from it. Okay, absolutely. And in that way, to kind of imagine the afterlife of injured cities, as is the title of this conference, and ask how histories of violence could be read and are read from the ruins, from the remnants of war. But initially, I would like to say, or to start, in fact, somewhere else in this project. The project of forensic architecture is located within and, in fact, tries to investigate what it identifies as a slight shift and a certain blaring. That shift, let us say a shift in emphasis, because I do not mean a situation in which one sensibility fully replaces the other, is between the political, aesthetic, and ethical centrality of testimony, trauma, and memory, that is human memory, in juridical, political, and cultural context, what is called, let's say by Fellman and Laub, the era of the witness, to another aesthetic, ethical, and political sensibility whose consequence needs still to be unpacked, which is has emphasis on materiality, and science, something that Tom Keenan and I, in a recent work called Forensic Aesthetics. At least in the context of war crime investigation, which is the context I would speak to today, an emergent object-oriented juridical culture is part of this general development that has directed attention away from witnesses, and with them a cultural and historical preoccupation with a subjective and linguistic aspect of trauma and memory, and towards an information saturated in the material world. Now, we need to understand that war crime investigation in terms of forensics are different than the context of criminal law. We are talking usually about the way in which complex systems, complex interaction between a multiplicity of players, actors within the battlefield, say, different technologies, the ideologies, the prevalent ideology and language by which they operate produce certain material effects that are read backwards as violation of certain codes. So, oh, sorry, here we go. This shift of emphasis, in this shift of emphasis, the great gravediggers of the 20th century have a major role. The dead, human remains, are both matter, material reality to be investigated, and something of, they are people, in fact, objects and subjects, somehow blurring that distinction, which is for me and in that project somehow the hinge. This is Clyde Snow, really one of the most famous of gravediggers of the 20th century. And in this, he presents the skull of Liliana Priera at the trials of the Argentine junta in 1985. He's always like a Hamlet kind of character. And in fact, what is distinct about the means by which Snow presents his skulls, human remains, in juridical context, is that he speaks to them as witnesses. He says, quote, "Bones make great witnesses. They never forget and they never lie." So he claims, but he would claim that because he's an expert witness in court. So of course he would say that his bones never lie. But in a sense, the difference between subjects and objects here is that the first supposedly lie or has some kind of degrees of unreliability, a reason that the prosecutors say in the Nuremberg trial, Jackson has excluded witnesses from the court. An object in which truth simply lies, simply fossilized in it, just waiting to be decongealed from the form and texture of bones. But of course, I want to show that some of the problem of the witness are reproduced in the kind of the forensic of materials. And I also think that after human remains, after discussing human remains, discussing architecture is exactly one of those elements. Architecture is that which is existing in this idea or this formation between a sensor and an agent. It is a sensor because, in a sense, violence, or no, initially, let's say, I mean, this we know very well, how to read political rationalities and other forms of cultural intention in the formation, in the syntax of architectural buildings, but also in a way in which architecture is a kind of a sensor. It registers within its materiality the events that happen around it in almost an archaeological sense. So forensic aesthetics is the mode of appearance of things in the world or in that context. Forensics is not only about the science as a tool of investigation, but as a mean of persuasion, and crucially, as a matter of belief. Not that other scientists, or the belief not of other scientists, right? We're not convincing here in a peer review process, but of judges, juries, and most importantly, of the public, right? How science is translated to be understood, to be convincing, to pose a kind of a narrative version. So in this presentation, I'll try to think about the conditions of presentations, or the condition of truth, within objects themselves. And these include the technologies of demonstrations, methods of theatricality, narrative and dramatization, the creation and demolition of reputation, credibility and competence that could be captured through this term forensic aesthetics. But how to discuss that, what is often referred to as the speech of object or the speech of things? So what is forensics itself? Derived from the Latin forensis, the word's root referred to forum and to the practice of skill of making an argument before a professional, political, or legal gathering. In classic Rome, forensics was part of rhetoric, which is, of course, about speech. However, forensics includes not only the speech of humans, but also that of objects. In forensic rhetorics, objects could address the forum. So we have a relationship between three components. Certain object that is asked to deliver testimony, a forum that needs to be constructed, perhaps, assembled around the object, and a translator, the person that speaks somehow the language of the object and the language of the forum, which acts as an interpreter or translator in that term. This was obviously the role of the rhetorician then, and today it is the role of the expert witness. The object and its interpreter therefore constitute a single entangled rhetorical unit composed of a person, a set of technologies, and an object. To refute a rhetoric statement, a forensic statement, it is necessary to dismantle the mechanism of this articulation, which means to show that either the object is inauthentic, that the interpreter is biased, or that the interpreter does not really speak the language of the thing. And I think that I will show you in the examples that follow moments where these attempt to dismantle that mechanism of a forensic statement has been articulated in different political contexts. So in a sense, forensics and forensic architecture is not only reading from architecture, the kind of the events that are saturated in it, say, but the constant construction of form, that is, different political forms or different assemblies that often come after the event itself. Usually in war crime investigation, the forum comes after the evidence itself. The evidence calls forth a forum to assemble around it. So obviously the ICTY could assemble around the evidence of things that are happening in former Yugoslavia, etc. Oh. Anyway. It is obvious that probability is the most common way in which science qualifies its finding. Probability is, through science, the way in which doubt exists in relation to the interpretation of all sorts of things. Probability in applied science is a measure for the likelihood that an event will have or have already occurred. It is also an attitude of mind towards some proposition whose truth we are not certain about. In fact, the term register itself the shift that I was talking about before. According to philosopher of science Ian Hacking, before the middle of the 17th century, the word probability comes to refer, it is used somehow in similar terms that credibility is used today. It is a category that relates to, say, the nobility or reliability of a person delivering testimony in court. Only with modernity does this word become a kind of shift from a designation of a characteristics of somebody to a sort of an analysis on that. When one follows a lot of forensic moments, a lot of forensic debates, one sees that the issue of probability is always at the forefront. Forensic statements are always qualified as a matter of probability. 95% this has happened, 85% that has happened, 15% it hasn't happened. In physics, obviously, issues of probability are not mutually exclusive. In law, they are. You have either you did it or you didn't do it, right? And the role of a judge or a jury is to calculate that kind of incalculable measure and arrive at a probability such as beyond reasonable doubt, which in science is a very low threshold of probability, and render decision on the basis of it. Decision comes exactly with the impossibility of calculation to provide you an answer, an absolute answer, right, in that respect. But whereas in law, and in fact, indeed in politics, decision is very important, in history, the question of probability must remain open. We must learn, I think, to understand, to enter the kind of the scientific logic of probability, to write history as that measure, not to treat it as an issue of judgment. Okay, let me skip to, well, okay, I think I will skip that narrative and move into that. Forensic architecture exists at the intersection of architecture, history, and the law of war. It refers to analytical method of reconstructing scenes of violence. But are bones and ruins a good analogy? What is asked of the bones and what is asked of the ruins? The issue, the kind of the little narrative that I skip now is processes now undergoing in Spain regarding an attempt to identify remains, human remains of, Republican victims of the Civil War in relation to an aborted legal process, that is of Baltasar Garzón attempt to take Franco to court for crimes against humanity, Franco and his regime. A kind of a trial of against a dead perpetrator, in which, in fact, because of the amnesty laws in fact, I see that I'm speaking about it, so we will return to this. Because of the amnesties law of Spain that have forbade opening up investigation of anything that happened between summer 36 and summer 1977, it is the non-identification, it is the missing people that in fact the crime could be renewed. The crime has not happened between 36 and 77. It is renewed any moment, any day anew, and in fact the kind of the mechanism by which he attempted unsuccessfully, we can speak about it later, to open up this case. So a lot of what is asked of the bones are who are you? But the ruins, what we ask the ruin is how you were destroyed. And I think here, perhaps we have an equivalent image to Clyde Snow presenting the skull in the context of the law. We have Justice Goldstone, that I'm sure you know, who investigated the Gaza attack, Israel attack on Gaza in 2008, 2009. In fact, standing in front of the ruin, right? There's microphones in front of the ruin, but he's there kind of interpreting the ruin to an international forum that is here held by those microphones. So you have a kind of a forensic moment of those three components. What is he trying to read in that rubble? Whether the building was destroyed legally or illegally, right? The question of destruction is not being asked, but whether in proportional or other kind of tenet of international law, the building has been destroyed in that manner. I think that within the increasing urbanization of conflict, representation of the built environment are increasingly called as evidence in international courts, tribunals, and media. So we have a situation by which war happens in a city, violence is registered on buildings, and buildings are called as evidence or witnesses into in kind of juridical context. In fact, in the Gaza war of 2008-2009, most people that died, most civilians that died in Gaza died in buildings. And of them, most people died in their own homes, right? So buildings were not simply the kind of the site of death. It was the means of destruction itself, and therefore the emphasis on the forensic of architecture became so important. The man who, in fact, undertook a lot of this investigation, and to which Goldstone, in his report, refers to at least 36 times, 36 footnotes, is this man called Mark Garlasco, who, at the same day that the Goldstone report was published, this is middle of September 2009, he's being suspended from Human Rights Watch. And the reason for him being suspended is a kind of a deluge of kind of blog posting that came to reveal that Mark Garlasco is one of the biggest collectors of Nazi-era memorabilia, right? And they accused him of being a Nazi fetishist. And in fact claimed that because he is, or that interest of him, he is not qualified, or he cannot, right? This is one of the mechanisms of dismantling the forensic speech. Because he is a collector of Nazi paraphernalia, he could not speak on behalf of the ruins in a way that is against the Israeli state. In fact, after thinking about that a lot, I decided to defend that man. And the way of doing that, and the argument I used, is that not in spite of the fact of his collection, but because of it, we need to understand, we need to accept his forensics, right? There is something of the fetish in forensics itself, in a way of turning the evidence into a kind of a quasi-human thing. So that is, all that is kind of existing around that blaring of object, subject, also through that, through those issues. In fact, when I was talking to Garlasco about his work, an even more bizarre story started to unfold. Garlasco, before being working for Human Rights Watch, has been working for the Pentagon as a targeteer. In fact, he was working for the Pentagon on the run-up to the Iraq invasion and attack, the kind of the shock and awe moment of the attack, under which the Americans wanted to kill the entire political leadership of the Ba'ath Party in Iraq. His job was to track and bomb each one of those people, the 12 top Ba'ath leaders, and he had a little qualification within there. According to the Pentagon's proportionality analysis, proportionality, that means a kind of a balance, a calculation between effects and side effects, between aims and bad things that happen to bombing. He was allowed to kill up to 29 civilians, right? 29 designated a threshold of sacrifice between necessary death and illegal killing, right? So the 30th would have been an illegal killing. Of course, that number was defined according to Pentagon's own kind of media sensitivity, let's say. But in order to calculate that, Garlasco had to learn architecture or structural engineering and urbanism in knowing how many people exist in a building, and produce his ruins as one would design the design of ruins, right? In order to, if there is no threshold, you would simply drop a 2-ton bomb and destroy the building where the leader is and kill whoever is there, tant pis. If there is, the threshold itself means that proportionality becomes material proportionality, becomes about a certain design of ruin, part of a building, top floors, angles within it, etc. And the horrific thing about, that I discovered later, about that material proportionality here was exactly that. Forensic architecture comes out of the same technologies that it seeks to monitor, right? And there was, and we need to understand that development in the technologies of targeted killing that increase the kind of the possibility of designing ruins also allow the reading of that. In fact, he resigns from the war a few weeks after doing his bombings. He killed always up to the level of civilian casualties that he's allowed, but none of the targets have been killed. He resigns in kind of in disgust and take a job in Human Rights Watch. In fact, doing the very same work he's done, proportionality analysis on a different number this time. So I think that the moment he goes to Iraq for the first time after the war, he's never been there. He knows exactly where to look for the ruins. And that moment where he writes the report, a human rights report on his own actions, he writes a report on the aerial war, is the moment where kind of the making of ruin and the reading of ruin somehow inverse in that respect. So, I mean, here you would see simply, this is him in a lecture. Don't mind the kind of the salute, but in a sense, being a human rights person, obviously he takes picture of people that he wants to identify with. Human rights people usually take pictures of children and women. But whatever interests him in this photograph is actually at the background of this, from which he kind of unpacks the issues of that. Another, to finish, I see I'm not even at the beginning as usual. I'm completely misjudging time. I want to show another moment where forensic architecture and its problems are starting to kind of make that blaring in a different way. The trials of the West Bank Wall in the Israeli court, this is the High Court of Justice in Jerusalem, this is about petitions of Palestinian farmers against the wall, are not trials of people, right? They are not trial, they were never trial of the designers of the wall or of the military leaders that decided on it. They are the trials of the wall. They're trials of the wall as an accused, right? And the operating principle here, which is somehow equivalent to that of probability, is proportionality, right? So proportionality is a way here in court to measure the good behavior of the wall. Does the wall mediate between security principles on the one hand and infringement of property rights or human rights of Palestinians? And in that court, the model was somehow the main kind of piece of evidence that is presented, right? And, okay, so we have a trial of a thing, not a trial of people, but a trial of a thing. So we have something else in which kind of, a different way in which forensic architecture kind of operates, and that works by the proportionality or material proportionality, as we say. Of course, there's a long history to trials of things from medieval, in fact, from kind of Athenian to medieval, in which things are taken to court and, in fact, also punished. But here, there's an interesting thing. The minute the model is entered into court, and in the High Court they did not make any provisions for model, what is created is that the judges, the jury, not jury, the both sides, starting to assemble around it. Legal protocol is broken. Nobody is speaking about your honor or my learned friend or anything. But the model itself starts producing the legal process as a design process, right? Everybody breaks into each other's talk, and a certain negotiation, a certain forensic engineering of the wall. The wall is being designed through the process in court right there and then. No, the judges do not see the model. They are sitting, the bench is too high, the model is too low. They go down, they call everybody, and somehow the material language of the model start interrupting. This is our Chief Justice Barak, Aaron Barak, kind of operating somehow as the design of the wall. And I think that in here, that category that I have developed in my previous book, Hollow Land, which I called the political plastic, right, becomes important. The political plastics is the way in which material and form folds into itself a force field. In the way in which you can read somehow, it's never, you know, material is never fully transparent to abstract forces. But in another way, they are registered within it, within the contour and arrangement of form, and that very complicated forms, that, as you know, is a kind of a snapshot from. I should be able to press play on this map, and you would see how the kind of the change of politics completely re-articulate that image. The political plastic is exactly that relation between force and form that issues like proportionality and forensics are kind of talking about. And the means through which, as I started the talk, to say architecture is both a sensor and an agent within that process. So thank you for listening.
I'm based in Johannesburg, as you've heard. I'm an artist whose practice is split between two forms. The one is studio practice, which is more or less kind of traditional understanding. The traditional understanding we would have of how an artist works. So painting, drawing, installation, video kind of work, and largely made by myself. And much of the content of that practice is the archive, what we remember, how we remember, and by whom, and the technologies of memory. And over time, that has led me to be asked to collaborate with other people, architects, historians, oral historians, anthropologists, writers, filmmakers, on heritage projects. And the result of that is a collective which is called Trace Group, and I work in this group with very important colleagues, and I want to name them: Mark Gafissa, the writer; Lauren Siegel, writer and historian; Steve McQuena, filmmaker; Churchill Madikita, an artist; and Nabil Essa, an architect. And we work on and are commissioned, sometimes commissioned to do projects, sometimes we initiate projects, which are about I suppose recuperative projects about heritage in one way or another. And I'm going to show you a few of those today. Do I control this? If so, where? Oh, there we go. Johannesburg is a mining town. Began as a mining town, and in the opinion of many people, it still is a mining town. It's somewhat rough, a bit crass, determinedly materialistic, and not a little bit violent. it is built around these great big slag heaps. And as you can see, the city is articulated in between these great lumps of material which was once underground. And once mined, the ore is piled up in these great bleached masses, and they substitute for topography, and in some cases over time they mimic topography. They're our version of the picturesque. Josie, or Igoli, which is what we call our city, is a magnet for migrants, and has been for the century, or a century and a little bit of its existence, and it continues to be, both within the country, within the continent, and beyond. Its population and its urban geography are fluid, both in micro and in macro terms, and it is constantly being redone. You get the sense of the city which has been remade in probably twice in a generation. And as a consequence of this constant redoing and renewal, our relationship to earth, to the underneath, to soil as material, is ever there. Sinkholes made huge or holes rather, made huge by miners, or small through the reworking of the city, is very much part of our lives. And this is a sinkhole, and it reminds us that the apparent city, the city which we inhabit and see, and which is the kind of visual context of our existence, has a doppelganger city underneath it, which in some ways echoes it, and there's a symbiotic relationship between the underneath and what is above. And it's that relationship which informs a lot of my, both as reality and as metaphor, which informs a lot of my practice. The energy of the city is noisy, discordant, awkward, impatient often, and a temporal now, an insistent now, is expressed in the speed of the place, filled with the shouts and jostlings of people competing in Johannesburg to explore and test both its promise and the pressures of the place. But for many of Johannesburg's inhabitants, the demands of the present leave very little room for thinking in another tense of the past or the future. And the syntax of the city, if I can put it like that, the syntax, visual, oral, and spatial, describes an insistent now, an insistent present tense. And the billboard is the dominant public image of the city, spectacles large and unambiguous enough to be appreciated by people in transit or from the windows of inner city apartments. These two speak of immediate, if fictive, needs. I show you this and I give you this introduction, and particularly concentrating or thinking about speed as a way of understanding the context of the city and perhaps of the nation, because I realize that increasingly a lot of what I and my colleagues do is at odds with the impulses of the city and perhaps with the nation. We tussle with the predominant syntax of speed in an effort to insert spaces and languages of reflection for heritage exists somewhat precariously in a culture of speed and in a culture of the insistent now. So it is in part my theme, time, or rather a kind of broken or porous time, which allows passage between the present and past and prompts a future envisioning. In this image over here, where this is the beginning of a project on Constitutional Hill, and we're standing on the ramparts, on the earthen ramparts of the site. On the right hand, these are 19th century ramparts which defended a fort. On the right of the rampart is the remains of the fort, which over time got made into a prison, and like all prisons in South Africa and apartheid in colonial South Africa, it was organized according to race, so this was the prison for white males. If we look to the left of the rampart, we see on the right of the slide the Constitutional Court building, and it is right up against this white building in front and going down the hill, what was the prison for black males. And this juxtaposition is a kind of emblem, I suppose, of how heritage is being approached for many people in South Africa, that we cannot explore the future and we cannot explore the present tense without simultaneously experiencing the past. And this has been expressed physically, in spatial and in physical terms. When we first saw the site, when we first came onto the site, we were struck by its sense of abandonment. It had not been used as a prison for 20 years before we actually got on site. And it was as if the state of the site spoke to the history of the place, or at least formed some kind of metaphoric bridge to that history. These surfaces, which had once been pristine, and swept and cleaned to the point of madness by both Public Works Department and by prison inmates, now were broken and exposed layers of the past. And we determined, we were very struck by this and by how it prompted some kind of emotional response, which we hoped was the start of a visitor experience. And we determined the physical language of the museum in relation to this, so that we would always be looking through whatever language we use, so in this case glass as panels, to the layers of the building behind. But of course, it never looked like that. This is what it looked like. It was always impeccably maintained and painted and cleaned. So we started with a kind of lie. Perhaps a useful lie, but nevertheless it was a lie. And what we determined was that the buildings would be maintained, or rather the buildings would be stabilized, but they would not be restored. And so the patina and the texture that time had affected on them would remain. So the viewer, on entering the site, is immediately moved into the realm of metaphor rather than into realism, which complete restoration might have prompted. I'll return to that decision to leave the buildings in this kind of distressed, if I can use that word, state, because in another of the buildings on site, in the women's jail, another decision was made. But I'm going to go to the collection of human rather than architectural history. We, like, as is kind of standard practices in these processes, met with consultative groups, sometimes through individuals and sometimes through groups. This is a group of ex-PAC prisoners who had maintained very strongly the coherence of the group outside of prison as they had inside of prison. And this was, we found, to be quite a common experience. And we began a process which we called mapping memory. And in this slide, this person everybody we gave them red flags, and they went around the site, literally to place these flags where memory needed to be mapped, bearing in mind that the site had changed enormously over this period of 20 years. So what somebody might have remembered as happening in a particular place had now been erased, covered over. There might have been tarmac over where there was a building, or it might simply have been demolished. And this was a source of enormous trauma for many people. The fact that they could not place their distress physically. They could not find the exact place where something had happened to them. So this process of remapping the site and forming a continuity, an intergenerational continuity of site, was very important in its making. And one of the most important narratives was about cell geography, how people slept within these cells, what was the hierarchy of arrangement within these cells. And of course they varied enormously according to who was in a particular cell, whether they were so-called common law prisoners or whether they were political detainees. And these drawings then were used for the determination of, or not the determination, but prompted the eventual exhibition. And this is one of the first drawings of the which I made. And the challenge for us was to find, and the challenge always for us is to find a kind of language which is going to be commensurate with the experience of the place and of the people who were within that place, and to avoid illustration. We had a very well-known museum consultant come out to South Africa to advise us, and his immediate reaction was, Clive, make 30 body casts and stick them in there and you will get a great response. And this sat very ill with all of us, and I kind of came to think of it as illustration, and in trying to understand why I reacted so negatively to the suggestion, I eventually came across a wonderful phrase, narcissistic empathy, written by Gayatri Spivak, which talks, in my understanding, speaks about empathy as a kind of spectacle which satisfies the viewer, but doesn't actually provide some kind of bridge to understanding the context within which that trauma had been affected. So the historical context and the link back to that trauma was very important in determining the languages. We worked with prisoners who came up with this solution for representing the body. They too did not want this kind of body cast kind of solution or illustrative solution to the body. And it turns out that, in fact, this tradition of working with blankets, with prison-issue blankets, was part of the language of the prison and had been used, has a life mind of its own, had been used in kind of competitively between cells. And this construction of this canon, kind of witty canon, limp canon, was an example of the sort of thing that had been produced using the same languages. Rather less charmingly, it was also used to produce other things. On the left, a coil which was used to torture people, inmates torturing inmates through putting the coil over the head and then tightening it. And on the right-hand side, a skirt which indicated a kind of sexual positioning, or gender positioning. We tried to use languages which had very little physicality. We tried to use projections and audio as much as possible. In this case, what prompted this image was the narrative that the only thing that could not be controlled for inmates was the sky. And the images of planes flying over the sky was a way of thinking an alternative place. Food, is an incredibly important currency within the prison, and like everything in South African prisons, it was determined by race. So whether you were black, so-called colored, or Indian, you got a different diet. These little casts are illustrations of Christmas treats, again determined by race. Coffee, I can't remember the hierarchy, but coffee, extra sugar, and a piece of cake. There is very little record, obviously, or very, very few images of photographs of what happened in the prison. And this process of verification, I suppose verification was very important throughout our processes. And the most obvious form of it is through the photograph, but it's not necessarily the one that we used always. Sometimes we use audio, sometimes we use drawing. Or sometimes we use writing, but this is the only extant photograph of what happened in the prison. It was taken from a building adjacent to the prison, and it describes a thing called the Taza, a dance called the Taza, which proved that there was nothing concealed in the body. And here we have, in fact, the text is from one of the warders, ex-warders in the prison, talking about having to enforce this process. These are the doors of isolation cells, which were scratched into. The only form of kind of marking that somebody had been there was, in fact, to scratch into it. And we preserved these doors. And in some ways, were influenced by that language of incision into metal. And this is a tribute from the Chief Justice of Nigeria, congratulating South Africa on the adoption of the Constitution, and these are displayed within the building. Now, the women's jail is a very different kind of building. It was built on a plan imported from England, like many colonial jails. This is the atrium of the jail. It was, the decision was taken to restore it fully. So it was patched, painted, made absolutely as it would have been during the time that it operated. In part because the decision was also taken by the justices of the Constitutional Court, amongst others, that the building would have many functions. It would not only be a museum, but it would be a kind of a conference center for kind of civil rights activists, and in fact would also house offices for what we call Section 9 companies in South Africa, so the Gender Commission, amongst others, would be in these offices. So you would walk through this atrium in order to get to an office. And so we decided to put the exhibition on the top of, most of the exhibition, on the top of the office, of the atrium. We went through very much the same kind of process of speaking to people who had been in the prison, gathering their testimonies, bringing them back to site, doing the same process of mapping memory. In this case, this person has put a flag to indicate a wall where fruit was thrown from one part of the prison to another. But at the top of the atrium, there are a series of exhibits which speak the predominant narratives which had come up in the testimonies of people who had been imprisoned. And on the right-hand side there is a pile of rags. And that was important not only because of the enforcement or the use of cleaning as a punishment, but because it also, people were made to do this without any underclothes. And this reconstructed pair of pants is one of the most important exhibits within the prison. You see these exhibits from below in the atrium, so you get a sense of what is happening, and hopefully that draws people up there. This is a plastic bag. So many of people who were imprisoned here were imprisoned because of the pass laws which operated during apartheid South Africa. And some of the most moving testimonies were from people who had been shopping and sort of classic displacement. They would talk about the fish would spoil because I was imprisoned, rather than the trauma of actually being imprisoned. These are rooms which actually lead from the museum part of the structure to the Gender Commission and other offices. And these ghosts of their previous existence are these projections of people recounting their memories within these spaces. These glass panels are placed opposite isolation cells. They combine, or they chart why somebody was imprisoned and the constitutional clause which would prevent that imprisonment in the prison tense. The interior of these cells, very often an object was used as some kind of mnemonic and was held onto by people, as a way of marking their presence and marking an event. Sometimes we marked a space by merely putting text onto, in this case, a pane of glass about the birth of a child. Oops, I've got 5 minutes. And again, another series of languages. As I said, many of the buildings which had existed during the time that this was a prison had been erased. And we reconstructed the footprint of these. We had no plans for doing that. This, in fact, was the only record apart from oral testimony. This was a painting that Fatima Mir had made of her prison cell. And then she described to us how, sitting down, she spread her arms, she could touch the floor, and so we scaled the cell footprint like that. Okay, I'm going to skip this and go on to Chancellor House, which is a very different kind of project. Chancellor House was the building where Nelson Mandela and Oliver Tambo had their legal practice. And it's, for many years, a very ordinary kind of 50s building situated opposite the Magistrates' Court in Johannesburg. And for the last few decades, as there was urban flight and people had vacated the city, the building had deteriorated, eventually was squatted, and about 2 or 3 years ago, it was expropriated by the city of Johannesburg, restored, and they decided that they wanted to mark the fact that this was the office where Mandela and Tambo had their legal practice. This is our first demonstration to the client of what we thought should happen. What was unique about it is that the city had money to restore the building, but they didn't have money to have any custodians within the museum. So there was no operating cost for it. So the solution was, in fact, in a sense, the result of that problem, that we could have an external exhibition, in a sense, a pavement exhibition, rather than an exhibition which people would go, rather than the kind of museum where people would have to cross a threshold to go into the museum. And that turned out to be, in a sense, a kind of blessing in disguise. The little cozy cafe slide, which I've just shown you, that marks the previous functions of the building. And those minutiae are very important in establishing the kind of past textures of buildings and prompts for reflections or connections throughout. So there's a timeline which happens on the top windows, and on the bottom windows there are these panels set within inside them. Here we photographed it within the day. If you go, you have kind of these different sort of ways of focusing on the image. Sometimes you get that interpenetration of reflection, which works constructively. That is reflected there is the magistrate's court. These are the panels from the side as seen from the inside of the building. Another of the panels, a documentation of the history of the area, the building at night, so you get a very different kind of sense of what that building is about. And the exhibition has proved to be incredibly popular. America has the States has a museum-going culture. South Africa, there's some trepidation about any institutional entry into any institutional building, but particularly into museum buildings. Now, I started speaking about languages, about speed, and the as a way of understanding context. This is a drawing which I made during one of the workshops, the mapping memory workshops, and I made it with enormous trepidation and anxiety. But I was asked to do it by one of the participants, and she insisted that I did it. And she described with great detail how the drawing should look and directed my skill. And I realized after a while that why this was important was not because I was making an artwork in any way. It was that I was providing verification, that in the absence of a photograph, the drawing was proof that it had happened. And so then I became the conduit for many of these, or not many, but for many similar experiences where somebody would ask me to draw, say, the funeral of their son, which had happened whilst they had been in prison. And then these became the only record, basically, that the proof that this had happened to them. We've spoken a great deal about over the past 2 days about languages of healing. And it strikes me that something of the speed of Johannesburg, this insistent accumulation of the instance of the now, the assertion of the now, is in part a flight from trauma, and that's one of the things which we have to deal with to establish languages and spaces which encourage a relationship or encourage a means of stopping that flight, of creating a kind of pause, so in order to enable this process of healing. Thank you.
let me begin by stating the obvious, because I think that the obvious continues to stare at us on the face, and we seem to be unable to engage it, not only ourselves, but our institutions. So I wanted to begin by sharing with you the most powerful 2 lines that I've seen recently, a statistic that appeared in the New York Times in the last months. The top line is a line of inequality, generally speaking, and the bottom line is a line of marginal tax rates on the wealthy. It's been said on and on that the current crisis, that this is the worst recession since the Great Depression, and I wanted to unpack that a little more because we are all in agreement that these last 2 points in recent history have been very much similar. Unprecedented inequalities concentrating at that very point. 1% of Americans earning more than 1,000 times than the rest of the bottom 90%, et cetera, 99%. We're in agreement about the similarities. We're in agreement that at these 2 points also this coincided with the lowest taxation on the wealthy at those very particular moments. So unprecedented inequality, and we are all in agreement, of course, about the similarities, but what seems to be absent from the debate, and this is something that I'm telling myself, is that we very seldom talk about the differences after each of these moments of unprecedented, again, crisis. And I want to dwell on this because I think that no conversation can begin without really dwelling within the very controversy and the conflicts that we are really experiencing, that we need to unpack them. After the Great Depression, the years after, I'm not a historian, so I don't want to really get into specifics here, and besides there is no time, but let's say that a New Deal emerges. By 1944, FDR presents a mode of taxation, the kind of reformation of institutions in really re-engaging a kind of political will, a self-assured, in fact, political will to re-engage the debate of the public and of the public itself. By 1994, the taxation was at 90%. The second Bill of Rights is presented in January of that year by FDR. I wish I could read it. I recently found it. It's very accurate and sort of current at this moment. Public spending, public infrastructure, public education, of course, and housing are not damned words or concepts, as they have been forbidden in our own political language. So there is this amazing reorganization of resources to really produce what this is, the middle part of this diagram, really a period of unprecedented, equally, public spending in the city. What is happening now is a question, of course, because what is happening now after the 2008 is completely different. Again, generally speaking, from this middle zone of this diagram, 1945 to 1979, we can see seemingly a more equitable distribution of resources. But of course, as we all know, by 2006, the economy had already inflated this sort of huge bubble that had only fattened a very reduced and exclusive sector of our society. 10% of Americans own 50% of resources, 1% own 24% of resources. By 2008, this bubble burst, as we all know, and of course, this reveals, and this is something that I've been talking about to myself as well, the falsehood of trickle-down economics that somehow has sold to the American imaginary, or the American, a notion of the American dream that is promised by detaxing the wealthy so that someday that wealth will touch each of us. This sort of belief in a kind of a system of emancipating the individual for unchecked economic expansion and so on. So after this, I begin to reflect on what happened afterwards of 2008, and I call it the 3 slaps on the face of the American public, very different from after the Great Depression. First, the public comes unwantedly to rescue the very architects of the crisis in the shape of Wall Street bailouts, first slap. Then, of course, this not only begins to diminish the relevancy of the public, but after that, the lack of collateral kind of management of loans and defaults to protect the American homeowner produces millions of foreclosures that in turn produce unprecedented unemployment, second slap. And furthermore, now that the economy shrinks, the euphoria of a very small but very outspoken group of right-wingers in this country begin to sell the idea to the American public that we need to sacrifice by creating unprecedented public spending cuts on education, wealth, infrastructure, you call it. This is really the last of these slabs that leaves us, in fact, incredibly injured. So the shrinking relevancy of the public is the point of departure to any conversation at this moment. because in fact that 1% has remained untouched, undented, unaccountable. This consolidates the culture of accountability and impunity, in fact, by this 1%. And I'm saying this because the main difference between 1928, after 1928 and today is that then they had the economic power, but afterwards, at least the political power was still in the hands of the public. Today, this 1% owns also the political power in the shape of an unprecedented lobbying machine fed by right-wing, in a sense, philanthropy that has really been able to buy votes and public opinion, and we know the history. But this is a cultural crisis. I know that we continue to speak of this as in fact, an environmental crisis and an economic crisis. Is primarily a cultural crisis. I would like to put on the table here a crisis of the institutions that are unable to think of other different arrangements, different processes to propose a way out of this. Another thing that the difference also between 1928 and today is that then it was visceral. It really was in front of our faces. In fact, inequality was very, very much present. Of course, this suggested in our time a society that is anti-government injures the city, a society that is anti-taxes injures the city, a society that is anti-immigration injures the city, a society that is anti-public injures the city. And these are our own ruins. And these are the neighborhoods of East Baltimore or North Philadelphia, which are not necessarily war-torn environments, as Ayal presented, but equally the material reality of those needs to be investigated, but more than ever, also the institutional mechanisms that produce these environments. In fact, these environments have been there ever before 2008. And this sort of reverse engineering also is not in the hand of specialists, but on regular people like Dan and Terry, who decided to create a reverse engineering diagram to trace their mortgage. And this is just one page of the 3-page document. So we need to, I think, in our time, move from notions of neutrality in art and architecture, when we begin to continue to perpetuate the symbolic content of things, instead of the practical kind of, how would I call it, the drama of the kind of practical specificity, let's say, of the Constitution and the production of the political itself. The moving from the neutrality of the public, that we as artists and architects continue to think that will magically appear after our nice designs, to the very specificity of rights, because the most emblematic image of the civil rights movement in this country seemed to have been produced in a bus. But that bus was public, but was not accessible to everybody. So I think this necessity to enter into the realm of the design of protocols in our time is also in the hands of artists and architects. I'm interested in the rights of the neighborhood, and I've been operating in border neighborhoods at the border between Tijuana and San Diego, and recently I had a chance to go to South Korea to engage the politics of housing in this country, where I tested a series of devices that really began to open up this relationship, I guess, that my practice has to the social and the political. I'm here in the municipality of Anyang in South Korea, speaking to the curators of this art event. And in the distance, I see these little houses spread through the hill, similar to a kind of bucolic landscape of Southern California, very similar. But when I get close to the window and I see down, I realize that these are just the water towers, the top of what actually was a more homogeneous urbanism on steroids, of this sort of vertical sprawl, similar to California as well, but California is a pancake, it's a horizontal sprawl. And I began to realize that one of the conflicts I wanted to engage here was the conflict between the vertical and horizontal, as governments and city agencies continue to be unable to mediate between these two conditions in terms of density. I decided that the project was going to be one of, in fact, entering into the neighborhoods that were going to be demolished in this satellite city to Seoul. 5 neighborhoods that were going to be demolished to build those humongous homogeneous housing projects. And I decided that it would be an amazing project to actually produce models, in fact, of each of those neighborhoods. I've been also interested in this idea of models not only as evidence, but as mediating tools to enter the debate across these divided institutions. Here was the idea that the model was going to be built not only to understand the looks of community, but what these communities do. And in a sense, it was understanding the performance of those neighborhoods that were being erased. And of course, this became a tactical kind of choreography of making the models with different sectors, including school children, including activists and university students. And the models were taken around the city to become the devices of a conversation across the different sectors. Not only activists, but also understanding as we were moving in the necessity to construct a new political language, because even activists in these neighborhoods did not have the tools conceptually to speak of the value, the hidden value, let's say, of some of those spaces that were being erased. As we were moving through the city with these conversations, we were also documenting amazing, creative, intelligent sort of encroachment into spaces by everyday citizens in these neighborhoods, such as this man who had a snail farm in 5 rooftops in one of these neighborhoods, and vegetable gardens as well that became essential to the economy of these environments, or this other man who took it upon himself to produce a micro-organization to produce a series of playgrounds in leftover spaces accompanied by vegetable gardens as well. It's a very much a kind of a culture that is very much alive out of these tactics of encroachment into leftover spaces, etc. So all of this is being erased by the designers. We also engage them in the conversation of these towers. It is the vibrancy of that street at that level that is erased, but also the conversations with the city agencies, the government, and even the Catholic Church, which is the main epicenter of resistance in the city of South Korea. So the possibility, again, of the models to begin understanding the performatic value of these spaces to claim a more intelligent, at times, more self-assured set of demands against the government. And so we produced a Bill of Rights for the neighborhoods that were going to be demolished and was presented out of this conversation to the mayor of Anyang, some of these having to do with the right of the neighborhood to enable the coexistence of different economies of housing, for example, the right to develop incrementally at different speeds of growth, the rights of these neighborhoods to share the profits of urbanization, enabling local modes of production, the right to retrofit themselves instead of being demolished, enabling small and inclusive developments. A lot of commonsensical issues, but nevertheless absent from the conversation. I'm interested in the operative dimension of participation, not the symbolic kind of content of community, but its operative, more functional sets of procedures that really enable the encroachment and the functionality of these spaces. And urbanization beyond the property line. In San Diego, Tijuana, I've been documenting not only the impact of immigrants in the retrofitting of American neighborhoods, but also stories that are compelling, in fact, in the hands of a group of white teenagers who invaded this freeway overpass in San Diego. This map presents the erasure of the city of San Diego for a moment, just to amplify the archipelago of voids, of these empty spaces, that somehow artists, we continue to engage them just as poetic fragments, but in reality, we need to understand them primarily as political, kind of the consequences of very fragmented political frameworks, a variety of codes and legislatures that really fragment the city into this leftover debris, very strange logics. For example, the paper streets that are in the code of planning code in San Diego. Paper streets are streets that were never built. They were planned but never built because when the surveyors got to that environment, they realized that there was topography, so it would be too expensive to build these streets. So they are invisible chunks of infrastructure that only private developers are recuperating for expanding their private property. Paper freeways that are surrounded by amazing amount of resources that also are hidden from our view, community-based NGOs, elementary schools, paper streets, easements, brownfields. I've been interested in the kind of enabling of a kind of, how would I call it, collaborative relationships across some of these hidden socioeconomic resources that frame and flank these empty spaces. So in other words, the artist or the architect becoming a kind of cultural pimp in a sense of relating or connecting the disparate parts across these agencies and institutions that remain invisible to themselves and to each other. Canyons that are forgotten, dilapidated, elementary schools, recycling centers, housing, paper streets, all of these amazing array of infrastructure that really would be enabling of a very different conception of public realm and cross-institutional resources. This one, which is one part of these islands, or this archipelago of emptiness, is a typical space where freeway collides with neighborhood. And I've been documenting a variety of these stories through video and cartographies, these stories of encroachment. And this one is about this group I was mentioning earlier, these teenagers who one night, they told me when I began to interview them a few years ago, one night decided to go to Home Depot to get shovels. and invade this space en masse, this underpass, this freeway underpass. And this is, in fact, the very accurate version of the island given by the municipality when I went to investigate this. This is the way that empty space is measured officially. The teenagers began to dig because they wanted to build their own skateboard park, since this city did not offer that possibility, and the police stopped them at some point. They barricaded the space, and the teenagers told me something that very seldom we speak about in our own fields. The first thing they needed to do was to investigate whose political jurisdiction really framed this space. Who owns this territory? Whose territory is this? They realized that they had been lucky because they had not begun digging under Caltrans territory. Caltrans is the state agency that governs the freeway, but that they had begun digging locally under an arm of the freeway that belongs to the local municipality, making it easier to negotiate with them. They had been lucky, they also said, because they had begun digging in a kind of Bermuda Triangle of jurisdiction between Port Authority, Airport Authority, 2 city districts, and a review board across Pacific Coast Highway. All these red lines, of course, are the emblematic political institutions and jurisdictions that divided that leftover terrain vague. After that, they said that they needed to go and begin a process of contacting each political actor representing these institutions. They organized as skaters. They went to the city to talk to the city attorney, convincing with the city council that would really enable this negotiation. They were advised that they had to become an NGO if they wanted to continue to negotiations. And as an NGO, they had to actually contact other skateboarders from Northern California that had gone through the same experience. The exchange of knowledge across these activist practices is essential. That's the reason I make it part of the story. They realized that they had to get their act together and producing budgets, construction, insurance, lawyer to represent them with the city. They had to become aware of what public space is as defined by the code, open space, because they realized that it was incredibly monocultural and very reductive in its kind of exclusivity. And the budgets that were allocated to those systems, they had to become aware of every permit available for encroachment and so on. In essence, there is no time here to tell the story with more sort of exactitude. They won the case, and the city, out of a transfer of liability, gave them the space to construct their small, their skateboard park. For me, this story is illustrative of how one small informal act of transgression can begin to trickle up to transform top-down policy, because it became an emblematic tool to begin redefining and rethinking the nature of these spaces under the freeway in the context of these communities. So the informal here is not just an aesthetic category. I want to present it primarily as a praxis. The informal as a practice that reorganizes imposed political boundaries and economic recipes. Whose territory is it, and who owns the resources are the main questions that began this process. No intervention in the public or in the kind of territory can occur without understanding the knowledge, the specificity of the political and economic power inscribed in that territory. Small parcels in many of these immigrant neighborhoods in San Diego perform in similar ways, and these communities of practice in these marginal neighborhoods equally are made of a set of operative procedures. I've been interested in my practice in San Diego, Tijuana to understand the impact, and I should say the positive impact of immigrants in their rethinking and in the transformation of the American neighborhood. This is another very lyrical map. No one single transborder land use map exists at the border. So I had to splice it in a very simple ways. So to San Diego to the north, the large chunks of exclusive, discriminating zoning, very gigantic in Southern California, and to the south, the high pixelation of alternative uses, more compacted in three-dimensional land uses in Tijuana. I've been arguing in the last years that this confetti of illegal uses have begun to infiltrate itself into the large, contaminating it with tactics of adaptation and retrofit. And when this confetti hits the ground, it actually transforms into very interesting informal economies and densities, small parcels that are transformed. I'm talking about the typical type of illegal addition that a family builds in the backyard to sustain an extended family, or an informal economy that is plugged into a garage and so on. These, I call them socioeconomic temporal contingencies. In other words, the retrofitting of Southern California by immigrants. And of course, this gets to very specific also visualizations, such as this post-war bungalow in this neighborhood, this marginal neighborhood in San Diego that was transformed in the last years into a Buddhist temple. And in so doing, of course, not only the house transforms into other types of uses, but it really enables this agency to make the neighborhood a site of production. It is a global city that has been and had been catapulted as a site of consumption particularly. The global city as a site of display supported by architects in camouflaging out of hyper-aesthetics and formalist practices these conditions of socio-economic power. But in marginal neighborhoods, which is my belief, they remain sites of cultural production and socioeconomic relations. Creative acts of citizenship suggest the citizenship here is enacted. I could say that immigrants in the United States are pointing at a future that enables us the rethinking of zoning and lending out of their own strategies of transforming behaviors, spaces, and institutional protocols. This is the very nature of citizenship in the context of the construction of the city. Rethinking density through this lens is essential because these environments cease to engage a language, a political language that tells us that density is simply a neutral recipe of an amount of things per acre, an amount of people per acre, which is the way we measure it everywhere. And in these neighborhoods, we can argue that density is measured as an amount of socio-economic exchanges per acre. And how do we visualize that? And how do we produce a very different idea of land use and a very different idea of economic structures from within these bottom-up energies? So the rethinking of ownership and property in the United States at this very moment is essential. My work has been trying to enter into the very specificity of the logics of economic development. The pro forma itself, the spreadsheet of the developer, becomes the site of intervention to begin injecting into it much of this invisible, again, hidden value as engaged and promoted in these environments. The need for alternative performance that can frame the very invisible creative intelligence embedded in these environments, such as the two women who might rent a 3-bedroom apartment, transform it into an illegal nursery, but they are represented, let's say, by community-based nonprofit organizations, such as the one that I'm working with in the last 10 years, and inserted into the economic pro forma. So this possibility, again, there is no time here to elaborate on this, to design also political and economic processes, which in fact have physical, spatial consequences, but accompanied, I don't want to sound like a developer here, even though that's what I want to become, because in fact, this is the only way to enable a very different and more democratic set of transactions. So designing new social contracts as well, accompanied by these processes. There is no time here, but I've been interested in the designing of micro policies at the scale of the neighborhood, such as the one that with the Casa Familiar in this neighborhood of San Isidro we've been constructing in the last years. And we have finally given the chance to transform zoning for this neighborhood, but the nonprofit becomes a mediating agency. I'm talking about here representation not just as images, but political representation that can translate and interpret some of these, again, invisible socioeconomic dynamics. It engages also other types of conversations with the neighborhood, transforming and challenging very reductive notions of density, mixed use, etc. I'm interested in urban pedagogy, to be brought back to the conversation, to problematize our conversation with communities and institutions, and to also the enabling of these illegal property owners to become co-producers and co-managers of some of these resources, the breaking apart of tax credits, subsidy-driven packages into smaller pieces to enable a small-scale development, and to enable also these neighborhoods to be experimental sites for rethinking housing paradigms at this moment. So these parcels are really ultimately micro socioeconomic systems at the scale of neighborhoods and communities. So this really results in the spatialization of some of these possibilities. We're working on projects that are very small in nature and small parcels. Some of them have existing infrastructures, such as this historic church that we are retrofitting in this small parcel as an incubator of new social and economic programming. I really am a believer in the incubating of a neighborhood. in a kind of set of conversations across artists, environmentalists, architects, community activists, and try to really come up with a series of devices to rethink the relationship of program, space, and people. Small social rooms that are equipped with collective kitchens that ultimately support a variety of programming. The Casa Familiar, the nonprofit organization, injects into these spaces very smart programming to produce levels of sociability and economic sustainability. Threaded through these infrastructural systems, different housing typologies, such as this small building, which is devoted to single mothers with children, or young couples that are made collaborators or co-producers with the artists who live in the site of new programming. A duplex for artists, exchanging rent for social service. These are artists devoted to social practice and engaging community, also choreographing pedagogical models with residents in this neighborhood. Large units with large kitchens for extended families who live with grandmothers that also are enabled by partnerships with the nonprofit organization that amplifies their entrepreneurial possibility here, and extended accessory buildings in very small sheds that are serve extended families. So what I'm trying to say is that the model really has to do with a variety of housing economies coexisting in a very small parcel, but also curated by a variety of actors to enable those types of transactions. I'm interested in that very specific design of interface across program, as I was saying, space and people. The democratizing of urban development is at hand then. How do we pixelate the city with a variety, again, of socioeconomic compositions, plugging housing with support systems, because housing, the way we've been conceiving it, has become unsustainable. Just as units, abstractly, they need to be supported with other types of political and economic frameworks. Zoning needs to be elevated as a generative tool that organizes activity, as opposed to a punitive tool that, in fact, prevents socialization. Let me end by just saying, or putting also on the table, there is no natural disasters, as a friend of mine mentioned recently. Natural disasters happen when stupid urbanization encroaches into the logic of natural systems, and there is no such thing of urban catastrophe. Again, there is a kind of design aspect of engineering decay by the institutions, and this primarily has been produced by a radical division, particularly at our time, between institutions and publics. We need, as artists, I think, and architects, to challenge the very politics and economics of growth. And I think there is a lot that we can say about it, entering the specificity of those protocols. This would be defined, though, necessarily by a new civic imagination. It is that interface with the public that needs to be curated. And let me finish by what Tanya Bruguera, a friend of mine, mentioned recently. Probably, she said, this is the time to restore Duchamp's urinal back to the bathroom. In seeking new types of critical relationships between art and the everyday, and particularly new types of triangulations between artistic research, artistic intervention, and the production of the city. Thank you.
Teddy, it's a very dangerous thing to show an image of a urinal just at the end of a session. Suddenly everyone is feeling anxious to go. We have a little time to open the discussion to you all and to allow our participants to speak to each other about the issues that feel resonant across the very different spaces in which they do their work. I want to just first thank them all for these incredibly provocative, rich, dense, and demanding presentations. To get us going, as I'm sure as you gather your questions, there will be someone with a microphone on the floor, and she'll come to you after you put up your hand. I just wanted to make a few very, very, very brief remarks and observations about what may not initially appear to be the common threads across these different geographical and different theoretical, different disciplinary interventions. Sorry, this is the first time I've ever been loud. And the first is the sense across all of these places that destruction and injury are not merely the results or the effects of catastrophe in either a natural or at least in an event-based sense, but are often the outcome of slow design processes, whether we're talking about the architecture of apartheid, whether we're talking about the engineering of bombing, whether we're talking about the economic zoning that makes impossible certain kinds of life forms. I think what struck me listening to you all, what struck me and what I perhaps had not expected to hear so firmly across each of your presentations was a concern with finding those forms in which to engage the question of, for lack of better words, truth and falsity, verifiability and unverifiability, and all the related words that come to mind in that regard. So if Eyal commenced by telling us that one of the tasks forensic architecture has before itself is how to read histories of violence from ruins, and therefore how to make appear the histories of violence on the basis of materialities which nonetheless do not speak that which has preceded the moment in which they're perceived. We end up with a very complex set of methodologies for speaking to the juridical sphere in a context where that is, one could invoke Shoshana Feldman here, where that is the venue in which trauma is now adjudicated. In the case of Clive Vandenberg's piece, I was struck that you commenced with a description of a decision to begin with a lie, in order to provoke a consciousness of the passage of time and to jar people out of their complacent relationship to the sense of the eternal present. And you went on to show us with that very troubling last image that you had been asked to draw. You went on to ask us to think about the kinds of verifiability available within the fictive, available within the aesthetic, that nonetheless do the work of producing spaces of recognition, if not truth-telling, then at least something that is proximate there. And with Teddy's paper, I was struck that you gave us, right off the bat, a reinvestment in those forms of representation that are often so much criticized as the instruments of rationalization and a certain kind of scientism, namely the graph, that made visible to us, that made appear to us the relationships between wealth, marginal taxation, and so forth. And then the deployment of mapping strategies, which are often used by power in order to zone people out of familiar forms of life, but in order to make visible precisely what the previous usages of those instruments had effaced. So in each of these cases, we are asked to think about the question of the verifiable and the unverifiable, the technologies of representation as enormously ambiguous and ambivalent, available for very different kinds of uses. But all of you spoke about this as a problem of language, how to find the right kind of language. You spoke in terms of syntax. You spoke in terms of the silences of cities, which are otherwise noisy places, and the need to find ways to make them speak and speak differently, and to make them the scenes of a speaking and a speaking differently that is the basis of sociality. So I'm going to stop there and just ask you all perhaps to think out loud a little bit about why language comes to be such a powerful question, such a necessary question in the context of our overall problem of thinking the aftermath and the afterlives of injured cities. And then I'd like to invite you all to add your own questions to these observations and remarks. And of course, you can ask each other questions too.
Great summary. Let's keep the order.
So, sorry, the question is why language? I don't know. I mean, I think that in at least in kind of my attempt to understand the different role or the changing role that, let's say, hard evidence is performing in the context of international justice, is to understand how science operate as a language, how science is communicating to not as the kind of as the ultimate sort of flashlight that would resolve all the ambiguities of testimony, but itself kind of completely being put in the hand of various sort of aesthetic practices of presentations and means of communicating them. But I think that if one speaks about new technological possibilities in reading matter as a development in language, perhaps, I think that one has to realize that in any development of new diagnostic technique, there is a seed of new institutional forms, right? And these are, it's on both those ends that I want to think the issue of forensic architecture with all its problems, with all the violence that is saturated in the language itself of reading, no? The possibilities starting 85 in Argentina, or indeed, let's say in Argentina, of reading, of looking at skeleton as in a context of war crime investigation as epistemic form, create and reorganizes a certain institutional forms, certain arenas of international law. So anything that is to do with language is also producing a kind of the sites within that which that language starts operating and reorganizing the possibilities of political mobilization or political form. Not all of them are benign and fantastic, no? But there is, I'm just very, I want to hold that question on both those ends, no? On the end of the different forms, and they're never simply a kind of arenas of, kind of UN Security Council looking kind of spaces. Sometimes they are very diffuse. They are organized as a kind of in network form by the media, et cetera, no? So, but in a sense, that is the language necessitate or development within the possibilities of reading matter reproduces a kind of politics on the larger institutional level.
Kai and Teddy, do you want to add some thoughts?
Mm-hmm. Is this one working? Yeah. I suppose if anybody kind of educated my generation in an art school in the, when was it, 70s, I suppose, would have kind of been educated in a sort of modernist tradition where making a drawing was a kind of act of self-expression, and it would be interpreted as a way of understanding me. The great, the kind of fundamental shift and shock really of making that drawing for Joyce was that I wasn't an artist. I merely had a skill. In a sense, she was directing my hand. So that kind of ego-driven modernist tradition of making a work just did not operate in that instance. And that made me rethink, in fact, the function of being an artist. And all of that has to do with languages, what kind of languages we use, where we apply them, how we use our capacities, and how we are responsible with our capacities. It's linked to some extent to the other disturbing image I showed of the Tauser, of the dance, where there was one photograph of what had happened in that prison. Within what was the language of veracity, or what had been seen as the language of veracity, it was startling to me that in fact for Joyce and for many of the other people participating in the workshop, photography wasn't the language of veracity. Drawing was as much a language of veracity as photography was. So that made me rethink in very fundamental terms what these languages signified.
And I'm thinking that what is brought up is the need to rethink language less within the kind of, how would I call it, structural self-referentiality, let's say, which is my problem with architecture in my own field, that has really embedded itself into certain protocols and do not allow it, do not enable us as architects to contaminate ourselves, let's say, with the domains that have remained peripheral to design. So the need to take detours. Enabling a different language means enabling a different set of procedures. So when we're speaking of ecology, as Geoffrey Capra mentioned, we cannot just think of the functional parts of something to themselves. Let's say I love this analogy, you know, the ecology of the bicycle, the functional relationship of the parts of the bicycle to themselves, but now it's not enough. He says we need to understand where was that bike produced, by whom, and what its political, economy, and cultural application, because it's different to ride a bike in Amsterdam than to China or California. So I'm thinking that it really has to do with enabling expanded notions, you know, not only of practice, by, at least in my case, I think it would be impossible to really enter the logics of, or seeking new paradigms of housing without understanding the logics of tax credit-based subsidies or current, you know, zoning composition. So I think that this is really a more problematic and I think radical sense of interdisciplinarity that is less based on the kind of image of something and more about its procedures. I'm saying this because my critique, even though I come from Latin America, is a critique of the metaphorical, which even though enables me, and I think will always enable us, but we've been so burdened by the metaphorical remaining a kind of fixed image. And as artists or architects, we tend to really be good at raising the issues, the problems, but we very seldom enable procedures that transcend or transgress those problems. So I'm thinking, what is behind images is equally a kind of construction of language.
There's a question here, Karen, and then one in the back. Can we have a microphone down at the front, please? Thank you.
Thank you for these papers. I have a couple of quick comments, but then a larger question. And I think I want to start with the larger question. I actually don't think they were talking about language. I think they were talking about complex spatialities and temporalities. And so it seems to me that Teddy's slide of trying to intersect the verticality with the horizontality is really what's really exciting to me in terms of the connection between the three. And so I'd actually like them to reflect upon their roles in promoting a kind of transdisciplinary practice and finding themselves working in different ways with their skill sets as practitioners. So Teddy, you're becoming this planner because you're able to do studio work in a way that is enabling, and the kind of work that you're doing I think is an incredible model in the way that we need to rethink exactly what you said, how to design and curate communities and neighborhoods and cities in a more sustainable way. I mean, and Clive, you are working as an artist, but then you're working in a kind of interface between heritage management, exhibition, display, and you're working with one of the International Historic Site Museums of Conscience. And so you're doing this other community-based enabling work, which includes singing. When I was there for the women's prison, they were trying out performances, installations of that sort. And music was a really, really important part of that space, which I know you didn't have time to talk about. And it seems to me, too, I think you're looking at models in a very different way than Teddy was. And I was wondering if you could push your analysis, because one of the problems I think that I had was thinking about forensic not only in more recent years, because the forensic archaeological trade has been going on for quite some time, and I'm thinking about South Africa in particular. So Skeletons in the Cupboard by Siraj Rasool is a great resource. But the model at the end of the wall, it seemed to me that you were starting to suggest that you're breaking down the performance of expert witnessing and the idea of truth-telling in a jurisdictional sense, and starting to look at it as a design process. But it, in fact, wasn't a kind of design charrette, I think, that Teddy was showing, because it was still the God's view perspective, even if it was a horizontal view. It assumes it looked like, and I guess you didn't have time to explore this, I wanted you to talk to me about it more, but it looked like there was a kind of territoriality and a marking of space in a way that I think was very different from the kind of community-based work that Teddy was describing. But I would just like you to expand upon those discussions. So really looking at practice and also working in ways that are not expected in your areas of so-called expertise, which is really important.
3 in 1. Okay. Do you want to, Teddy? Do you want to start by responding to that?
Well, you know, I'm just thinking. I've been one of them. I hate to be. It sounds so naive and reductive in the context of so many important scholars here. But one of my inspirations recently, mainly because we have, I think, there's a beautiful network of conversation happening. You know, not only with the other practices around the world talking about these issues, which is fantastic. But one of the most incredible inspirations came from Chantal Mouffe, if I can say that. You know, enabling this notion of agonism. The task of rethinking public space, you know, less as this manicured space, of course, where art will just become an object that symbolizes something, but really recuperating it as a battleground, where the hegemony, again, of political and economic power is simply visualized. And art then enters into a kind of mode of mediation, into a debate that is a lot more complex, without resolution necessarily, without conflict resolution. But this is very analogous to what I've been interested in terms of, yes, language on one hand, but really procedures at a scale of community. Because when I arrived 9 years ago to this Hispanic, Mexican-American Chicano neighborhood in San Diego, some of the first workshops had to do with just simply talking about style. In what style should we build, you know, and how do the buildings should look like? I mean, somebody mentioned we want a Costco that is painted with Aztec pyramids, you know, and maybe an artist might find an incredible quirkiness there, but I think that does not solve the issue. So I realized that the public is incredibly hijacked by this issue of packaging culture and identity through style and form, and that we needed to really resurrect other things. So it's about complicating the debate simply, and we began to enable these workshops where we began to talk about how the illegal additions, the informal economy explodes into those garages, the blurring of boundaries between two property owners that share space or encroach into the alley, those were acts of negotiation with boundaries and resources that could be more powerful instruments to think of identity. It's a more performatic aspect. And so here we were moving from the image to the kind of set of procedures. That began to open up space. So I'm suggesting it is, I guess in this context, the expanded notions of practice is about to produce a very different conversation, hopefully to return to the disciplinarity of our own fields, because it's important that we also convey something from that standpoint. But it needed to really begin with problematizing the debate, which I think is absent in the United States.
Clive and Al, do you want to add a short word or two?
It is very short. I mean, for me, it was a very simple thing. If I wanted to have a function as an artist which was different to a kind of gallery culture function as an artist, I had to learn new skills. And I did want to have that kind of function, and I broadened my skills. I make it sound very easy. It wasn't at all, because there was absolutely no preparation for any function other than as a kind of botanist based artist within the education I got. So I had to learn all of these skills along the way, but they were driven by need to operate differently within my society.
I think just very briefly to the question of the model, that I think that contemporary colonialism is not very unlike contemporary capitalism in the way that it uses participation to produce its fact, its build facts. And I think that scene that you've seen is really showing the limit of that kind of participation, i.e. Through proportionality, conflicts, and discussion, perhaps certain agonism is transferred into the way in which space is produced as a flexible. The wall is being designed with the participation somehow of the representatives here, or people that assume they are the representatives of the people who are incarcerated by it. And I think that is actually should give us a pause to think about participation in which context, what are the forms in which it operates, and where can it become counterproductive?
I'm being given a signal that it's time for us to close off this session lest we run into the next session. So I know that there are some of you who still have questions. I'm sure you can address them to the speakers in the break. But I want to remind you that there is enough time for you to go over to the Leroy Neiman Gallery to see the show, the exhibition of Lori Novak's photography, if you want to do so. We will try and get back right onto track and start at 3:30, so please come back as quickly as you can. Thank you.